The document that rewrote human history fits in the palm of your hand. 8 inches of baked clay, sitting in a glass case at Oxford's Ashmolean Museum right now, covered end to end in wedge-shaped marks pressed into its surface roughly 4,000 years ago. And inside those marks is a claim so extreme, so fundamentally incompatible with everything archaeology teaches, that the mainstream response has been to call it myth and move on. But here's what they don't tell you. On the same piece of clay, the same artifact, the names that start as legend eventually turn into real kings. Men whose actual possessions we've dug out of the actual ground. So the question becomes one that mainstream history still cannot comfortably answer. If the document tells the truth in the later sections, what exactly is it doing in the early ones? This is the Sumerian King List, and it may be the most terrifying text in recorded history. Not because it's violent, because it might be right. The Weld-Blundell Prism, as it's formally known, was recovered during a 1922 expedition in Larsa, in southern Iraq. It's a 4-sided column of fired clay, roughly 8 inches tall, each face divided into 2 columns of dense cuneiform script. The Ashmolean Museum in Oxford has held it since 1923. And the document it carries is essentially an administrative index of every city and every ruler that ever held power in ancient Mesopotamia. Except it doesn't read like any government record you've ever seen. It opens with one of the most extraordinary sentences in the history of writing. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. That's the first line. Not once upon a time, not a myth disclaimer, a bureaucratic statement of fact, recorded with the same dry precision the Sumerians used to log grain shipments and planetary movements. And then the numbers start. The first king of Eridu, Alulim, is recorded as ruling for 28,800 years. His successor, Alongar, for 36,000. When the kingship transferred to the next city, Bad Tabira, the reigns continued at that scale, 43,200 years, 28,800 years, 36,000 years. By the time the list finishes its first 5 cities, it has recorded 8 kings with a combined total of 241,200 years, a quarter of a million years. Covered by 8 individuals, look at the numbers. 241,000 years ago, our species was, according to the standard evolutionary model, just barely establishing itself as anatomically modern. We were not running bureaucratic city-states. We were not maintaining an administrative record with consistent mathematical units. And yet here is a document, a real, physical, verified document in a glass case in England that insists human kingship was already an operating institution at that depth of time. That's what makes this terrifying. Not the numbers themselves, the precision of the numbers. The Sumerians didn't write a very long time. They wrote 28,800. They wrote 36,000. Specific, consistent, mathematically structured. And that changes everything about how you have to read it. The official version, the version in every textbook, says these numbers are symbolic. Poetic exaggeration. A mathematical way of signaling that these early rulers were divine, not literal. Scholars have pointed out that the reigns are almost all exact multiples of 3,600, a unit the Sumerians called the sar. Alulim's 28,800 years is exactly 8 sars. Alongar's 36,000 is exactly 10. The argument goes that the scribes weren't measuring time the way we do, they were using mathematical code to express status. The bigger the number, the closer the king was to heaven. In this reading, the years are a symbol, not a calendar entry. That argument sounds reasonable, until you look at what the Sumerians actually did with their numbers everywhere else. They were among the most meticulous record keepers the ancient world ever produced. They tracked the movements of Venus and the moon across generations. They calculated interest rates on agricultural loans. They logged the quantity of every jar of oil in every temple storeroom. These were people who understood the difference between a metaphor and a measurement. And when they wrote these reigns, they wrote them in the same columns, in the same format, using the same scribal conventions they used for everything else. They did not put a disclaimer at the top. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The numbers aren't just large, they appear to be encoding something specific. The Sumerian base, 6-0 mathematical system, the reason we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle, produces a very recognizable fingerprint when you analyze the king list. The pre-flood reigns, across different versions of the list, consistently add up to totals that are exact multiples of 72. That number, 72, is the rate at which the Earth's axis precesses. 1 degree of precessional shift takes approximately 72 years. A full cycle of the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of our planet that gradually shifts which constellation sits on the horizon at sunrise, takes approximately 25,920 years. The number 43,200, one of the individual reign lengths, is 72 multiplied by 600. And the total pre-flood span recorded by the Babylonian priest Berosus, who compiled these temple records in the 3rd century BC, is 432,000 years, which is 72 multiplied by 6,000. That number, 432,000, doesn't just appear in Mesopotamia. The Vedic tradition of ancient India records the duration of the Kali Yuga, the current cosmic age, as exactly 432,000 years. The Norse account of Ragnarok in the Prose Edda describes 800 warriors emerging from each of 540 doors of Valhalla at the final battle. 800 multiplied by 540 equals 432,000. 3 traditions, 3 separate continents, 3 separate millennia, 1 number. Coincidence? Possibly. But a coincidence that sits suspiciously close to a precise astronomical constant is a different kind of coincidence. To even notice the precession of the equinoxes, you need something that simple observation cannot give you in a single lifetime. You need multi-generational records, stable, continuous, meticulous astronomical tracking across centuries, perhaps longer. The standard model of history says the Sumerians were just figuring out urban agriculture and basic writing around 3,500 BC. They did not, by that timeline, have the institutional depth to have observed a 26,000-year cycle. So where did the number come from? The official view says it's coincidence. A coincidence that appears independently in India, Scandinavia, and Mesopotamia, encoded in documents that each tradition claims was handed down from an earlier time. The Sumerians credited what they called the Anunnaki. The Vedic tradition credited the rishis of a prior age. The Norse credited the Aesir gods. 3 different names for the same origin story. We received this knowledge from before. And then the prism pivots on a single sentence. No warning. No gradual decline. The list simply states, the flood swept over the land. 5 words that divide the entire document in half. Before that line, kings rule for 28,000 years. After it, the reigns start at 1,200, then 960, then 900. Then they keep falling, moving through the centuries until they reach the decades we recognize from our own biology. The drop isn't gradual, it's a cliff. The document itself describes what can only be called a civilizational collapse, something that didn't just displace people, but fundamentally altered the rules of what was possible. Mainstream archaeology spent decades treating that flood line as a literary device, a theological placeholder the Sumerians used to explain why their legendary past was so different from their recorded present. Then, in 1929, Sir Leonard Woolley was excavating in southern Iraq, the same city the King List names as a seat of post-flood kingship, when he decided to dig below the earliest human burials. What he found, at a depth of roughly 40 feet, was a band of sterile water-laid silt, approximately 8 to 11 feet thick, sandwiched between 2 distinct layers of human occupation. No artifacts, no bones, no pottery, nothing living. Just pure deposited clay. Below it, the material culture of one era. Above it, something different. Woolley calculated that to deposit that volume of silt would have required the valley to be submerged under roughly 25 feet of standing water. To the people who lived there, he noted, a flood that covered everything visible in every direction was, for all practical purposes, the end of the world. Similar silt deposits were later found at Kish to the north, and at Shuruppak, the very city the King List names as the home of the Sumerian flood hero, Ziusudra. Let's stay with that name for a moment, because this is one of the places where the document starts to feel less like mythology and more like compressed memory. The Sumerian flood narrative centers on a man named Ziusudra, who receives a divine warning, builds a vessel, and survives the catastrophe with a small group of people. In the later Babylonian retelling, that man becomes Utnapishtim. In the Hebrew tradition, he becomes Noah. The mechanics of the story, the warning, the vessel, the survivors, the restart are the same across all 3. But the King List treats the flood differently from all of them. It doesn't tell the hero's story, it records the administrative consequence. After the water receded, the kingship had to descend from heaven a second time, the restart of civilization, written in the language of a government memo. If that alone is hard to explain, now it gets really interesting. Because the flood is not the only moment where the document brushes against verifiable reality. As the list moves forward through its post-flood dynasties, first Kish, then Uruk, then the others. The kings become shorter lived. And then, buried in the middle of the Kish dynasty, we hit a name that does something no earlier king on the list has managed to do. It shows up in the archaeological record. Enmebarajesi, king of Kish. The list records his reign at 900 years and notes that he subdued Elam and was eventually captured by a rival king. For centuries, historians treated him as a transitional figure, still legendary, part of the mythological portion of the list. Then, archaeologists found him. Not a story about him. Fragments of alabaster vases recovered from Nippur inscribed with the words Mebarajesi, king of Kish. The cuneiform used is archaic enough in form to confirm the age of the inscription. At least 4 surviving fragments bearing versions of his name have been identified across multiple sites. This is the earliest Mesopotamian ruler whose existence is confirmed by a physical object from his own time. And he is sitting on the same document as the kings who ruled for 28,000 years. The same format, the same column structure, the same scribal hand. That creates a problem that mainstream history cannot fully resolve. If we accept the alabaster fragments as proof that Enmebarajesi was a real human being, and we have to, because they're in the ground, then we have to look at his 900-year reign, recorded on the same artifact in the same script, and ask a harder question then, is this symbolic? We have to ask, what exactly is the King List doing? Because the Sumerians who wrote his name alongside his military campaigns and his 900-year reign were not careless people. They were the most precise record keepers of their era. If they put 900 years next to a man who actually existed, they had a reason. Either they were applying a different system of counting dynasties measured under a single founding name, the way we might compress a century of rule under the Tudors, or they were preserving a number from a tradition they received but no longer fully understood. Either way, they weren't guessing. And here's the thread that connects Enmebarajesi to the rest of the mystery. Because the King List places him as the father of Aga, who laid siege to the city of Uruk. And Uruk was governed, at that same moment, by a king whose name has become synonymous with the search for immortality itself, Gilgamesh. If the document tells the truth about Enmebarajesi and the alabaster proves it does, then Enmebarajesi's contemporary and adversary exists in the same historical moment. The man who commissioned the Epic of Gilgamesh, who built Uruk's walls, who wrestled with the question of death and the meaning of a human lifespan, may have been as real as the vase fragments that put his enemy's father in Nippur. In 2003, a research team announced that magnetic imaging surveys beneath the former bed of the Euphrates River had located a large buried structure matching ancient descriptions of Gilgamesh's tomb. The site has not been fully excavated. Regional instability has made that impossible. But the existence of a structure in precisely the location the texts describe is not nothing. It's a pattern. The King List points, and the ground responds. But here's the layer of this that the academics really don't like to discuss. If the later sections of the King List are reliable enough to lead us to real kings, real battles, and structures in the real earth, why did the same scribes who wrote those sections omit an entire regional superpower from the document? Lagash, one of the most important city-states in all of Sumer. Its ruins have produced thousands of clay tablets, massive temple complexes, and some of the most detailed royal inscriptions of the entire Mesopotamian period. The king Gudea of Lagash was one of the most prolific builders and influential rulers in the region's history. He left inscriptions, statues, building records, and his name is not on the prism. Not a single king of Lagash appears anywhere on the Weld-Blundell document. This is not an oversight. This is a city that we know, from the physical evidence, existed as a major power during the very period the King List is describing, and it was erased. The reason, as scholars like Piotr Michalowski have argued, is political. The King List was not designed to be a complete record. It was designed to support a specific ideology. That divine kingship, the mandate from heaven, could only exist in one city at a time. If 2 cities were both powerful at the same moment, that broke the theology. So the scribes who compiled the prism writing under the Isin dynasty, who needed the document to end with their own legitimacy, confirmed arranged the dynasties in sequence, one after another, even when the historical reality was parallel. Lagash didn't fit the sequence, so Lagash disappeared. That realization changes how you have to read everything that comes before it. If the scribes were sophisticated enough to erase an entire major city for political reasons, they were sophisticated enough to do the same thing to the pre-flood section. The 28,000-year reigns may not be naive myth. They may be a deliberate encoding, a way of placing the cosmological legitimacy of Sumerian kingship into a framework so mathematically vast that no later dynasty could challenge its precedent. You don't argue with 241,200 years. You don't outrank a king who served 8 complete SARs. The numbers are a wall, and the wall was built by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Lay the data points side by side. 1. A 4,000-year-old clay document recording 8 kings who ruled for 250,000 years before a flood reset civilization. 2. The total duration of those reigns encodes astronomical constants, multiples of 72, the exact rate of precessional drift that appear independently in Vedic and Norse tradition. 3. To detect those constants requires multi-generational astronomical observation that predates, by millennia, the period historians say the Sumerians began developing basic urban life. 4. A flood layer physically present in the soil beneath Ur, Kish, and Shuruppak, the exact cities named in the document dating to roughly 2900 BC. 5. A king on that same document, Enme Barajesi, proven by alabaster fragments to have been a real person with a real 900-year reign recorded alongside his real military campaigns. 6. The document deliberately erases the entire city-state of Lagash, proving its authors were curating history, not simply recording it. Now reorder what those 6 points tell you. The official version says Sumerian civilization emerged from nothing around 3500 BC, developed record-keeping, and then used dramatic numbers to mythologize its distant past. But the data says something else. It says the scribes who built this document were inheriting a mathematical framework. They may not have invented one whose astronomical precision required knowledge stretching back further than their own civilization. It says a catastrophic flood was real enough to leave physical traces in the ground of 3 named cities. It says the transition from impossible lifespans to human-scale reigns was not gradual mythology becoming history. It was a specific break, recorded at a specific moment, after a specific event. And it says, the people who compiled the final version of this document were masters of information control, which means every decision about what to include and what to exclude was deliberate. We think of civilization as a line moving upward. The King List reads like something else. It reads like the record of a people who remembered being higher and were trying to document the distance of the fall. Not a creation myth, not a founding story. A record of discontinuity, of a world that existed before, that was lost, and that could not be fully rebuilt. The Sumerians called the pre-flood rulers the ones who came down from heaven. They may have meant that literally. They may have meant it metaphorically. But they wrote those reigns with the same numerals they used to track the stars, and those numerals keep pointing back to astronomical cycles older than any city we've yet found. There is a second document, a second piece of this puzzle that most people have never heard of. A Babylonian priest named Berossus, writing in Greek around 290 BC, compiled a history of Mesopotamia from temple archives that no longer exist. His version of the pre-flood king list adds 2 more rulers and brings the total to 432,000 years across 10 kings. His source material is gone, but his number matches the Vedic Kali Yuga and the mathematics encoded in the Norse Valhalla. Whatever those archives contained, they were drawing from the same well that fed multiple ancient traditions across thousands of miles. That's not mythology spreading outward from a single point. That's independent preservation of the same data. I'm not going to tell you who ruled for 28,800 years. I'm going to show you that the people whose job it is to explain those numbers, the ones with the tenured chairs and the translation grants, have been sitting with this document for over a century, and the answer they keep giving is it's symbolic. But symbolic of what? Why would cultures on 3 separate continents independently encode the same precessional constant? Why would the same document that proves the existence of a real king name him as ruling for 900 years? Why would a flood recorded in 5 words on a clay prism leave a physical layer in the soil of the 3 cities it names? The official version says these are separate questions with separate convenient answers. The data says they are the same question, and the answer is buried somewhere between what was written and what was washed away. The next video in this series goes somewhere even older. There is a site in southern Turkey, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than anything. The mainstream timeline allows for organized human construction, where the builders left behind carved pillars depicting animals and symbols that some researchers believe represent the same astronomical precession encoded in the King List. The place existed before pottery, before agriculture, before cities. Yet its construction required a level of coordinated labor that no nomadic hunter-gatherer society is supposed to have possessed. What it tells us about who was keeping track of the stars before Sumer is the question the King List opens but cannot close. That's where we go